Rosemary Sutcliffe's The Eagle of the Ninth. Chapter 12. The Whistler in the Dawn. All that summer, Marcus and Esca wandered through the abandoned province of Valentia, crossing and recrossing from coast to coast, and making steadily northward. They ran into no serious trouble, for Rufrius Gallarus had spoken the truth when he said that the occultist stamp was a talisman that would carry its owner anywhere. In Valentia, as in the rest of Britain, there were many people with marsh ophthalmia, and Marcus did his best for those who came to him for help with the salves which the old field surgeon had shown him how to use. They were good salves, and Marcus had common sense and gentle hands and the craftsman's dislike of a job ill done, and so he succeeded better than most of the few quacksalvers who had passed that way. The tribesmen were not exactly friendly. It was not in them to be friendly towards men not of their own tribe, but they were certainly not unfriendly. There was generally somebody in each village who could give them food and shelter at the day's end, and always, if the way was difficult to find or dangerous to follow, a hunter from one village would act as their guide to the next. They would have paid well, too, for Marcus's skill. With a palmful of jet beads, a fine javelin head, or a dressed beaver skin, things which would have fetched many times the value of the salves south of the wall. But Marcus was not in the adventure to make a fortune, nor did he wish to jingle around the country loaded like a trader. And he shelved the difficulty by saying to each offer, "Keep it for me until I come back again on my way south." A late summer came, and the rowan trees that had been in new flower when Marcus built his altar in the glen of their first halt were heavy now with flaming bosses of berries, and on an August noon they sat side by side, looking down through the birch woods to the great firth which half cut Valentia from what lay beyond. It was a day like a trumpet blast, the wooded hills swimming in the heat, and at their backs the mares stamped and fretted, swishing their tails against the clouds of flies and that beset them. Marcus sat with his hands locked round his undrawn knees and stared out across the firth. The sun was hot on the nape of his neck, scorching his shoulders through the cloth of his tunic, and he would have dearly liked to copy Esca, laying on his stomach beside him, who had discarded his tunic altogether and now went stripped to the waist like a painted people. But to ride round the country in his bracco would have been beneath the dignity of Demetrius of Alexandria, and he supposed that he must continue to stew in his woolen tunic. He heard the bees zooming among the bell heather of the clearing, smelled the warm aromatic scents of the sun-baked birchwoods, overlying the cold saltiness of the sea, singled out one among the wheeling gulls, and watched until it became lost in a flickering cloud of sun-touched wings. but he was not really conscious of any of these things. "We have missed the trail somehow," he said abruptly. "It is in my mind that we have come too far north. We are all but up to the old frontier now. The eagle is surely more likely to be found beyond the northern wall," said Eska. "The tribesmen would scarcely leave it in territory, and was even in name a Roman province. They will have carried it away into one of their holy places." "I know," Marcus said, "but the traces should be in Valentia. And if the accounts of Caledonia that we have heard are true, we stand small chance of sighting our quarry among the mountains, unless we have some trail to follow. We shall simply wander up through Caledonia until we fall into the sea off the northernmost headland. A holy place is apt to spread signs of itself abroad for those having eyes to see, who come even a little near," Eska suggested. Marcus sat silent for a moment, still hugging his knees. Then he said, "When there is nothing at all, to guide a man in his choice, then it is time to lay the choice on the gods." And fishing in the breast of his tunic, he brought out a small leather bag, and from the bag a sesterce. Eska rolled over and sat up, the blue warrior patterns moving on arms and breasts as the muscles slid under his brown skin. The disk of silver lay in Marcus's palm, showing the head of Domitian, crowned with laurel, a small thing to hold their destinies. "Heads we push on, ships we try a cast back," Marcus said, and sent the coin spinning into the air. He caught it on the back of his hand, clapped the other over it, and for an instant their eyes met, questioningly. Then Marcus lifted the covering hand, and they looked down at the winged victory on the obverse side of the coin, which had been called ships from the days of the Republic, when the design had been the prow of a galley. "We turn south again," Marcus said. Turn south they did, and a few nights later they encamped in the old fort which Agricola had raised at Trinomontium, the place of 3 hills. 30 years ago, when Valentia was a Roman province in more than name, before Agricola's work had been all undone by meddling from the Senate, Trinomontium had been a busy fort. A double cohort had drilled in the wide forum and slept in the barrack rows. There had been many horses in the stables, cavalry maneuvers on the gentle southern slope below the ramparts, with the riders crested with tossing yellow plumes, the usual baths and wine shops, and the turf botheys of the women's quarters, and over all the crested sentries marching to and fro. But now the wild had flowed in again. Grass covered the cobbles of the streets, timber roofs had fallen in, and the red sandstone walls stood gaunt and empty to the sky. The wells were choked with the debris of 30 autumns, and an elder tree had taken root in one corner of the roofless shrine where once had stood the cohort's standard and the altars of its gods, and had thrust a jagged gap in the wall to make room for itself. In all that desolation, the only living creature that Marcus and Eska found as they wandered through it in the heavy stillness of the summer evening was a lizard basking on a fallen block of stone, which darted off like a whiplash at their approach. Looking down at the stone, Marcus saw roughly carved on it the charging bore of the 20th Legion. Somehow the sight brought the desolation home to him very sharply. If ever the legions come north again, they will have a fine building job on their hands, he said. The hoofbeats of their led mounts sounded unnaturally loud in the silence, and when they halted at the crossways, the silence had came rushing in on them, seemed almost menacing. It is in my heart that I wish we had pushed on to the next village, Eska said, half under his breath. I do not like this place. Why not? Marcus asked. You did not mind it when we were here before. For they had turned aside to look at the derelict fort on their way north, hoping against hope that it might hold some clue for them. Looking down at the stone, Marcus saw roughly, carved on it, the charging bore of the 20th Legion. Somehow the sight brought the desolation home to him very sharply. If ever the legions come north again, they will have a fine building job on their hands, he said. The hoofbeats of their lead mounts sounded unnaturally loud in the silence, and when they halted at the crossways, the silence that came rushing in on them seemed almost menacing. It is in my heart that I wish we had pushed on to the next village, Eska said, half under his breath. I do not like this place. Why not? Marcus asked. You did not mind when we were here before, for they had turned aside to look at the derelict fort on their way north, hoping against hope that it might hold some clue for them. That was at noon. Now it is evening, and soon the light will go. We shall do enough with fire, Marcus said in surprise. We have slept out time and again since we started on this venture, and had no trouble while the fire burned. And surely the only creatures likely to lair in these ruins are wild pig, and we have seen no signs of any such. I have not been a hunter since first I could hold a spear without growing used to sleeping in the wild, Eska said, in the same suppressed voice. It is not the forest folk that make me cold between my shoulders. What then? Eska laughed, and broke off his laughter midway. I am a fool. Maybe the ghost of a lost legion. Marcus, who had been gazing out over the grass-grown forum, looked round quickly. It was a cohort of the 20th that served here, never the 9th. How do we know where the 9th served? Eska said, after they marched into the midst. Marcus was silent for a moment. He came of the breed that did not trouble unduly about ghosts, and he knew that with Eska it was quite otherwise. I do not think that they would bring us any harm if they did come, he said at last. It seemed to me that this would be a good place to sleep, especially with the curlews calling rain, as they are this evening. But if you say the word, we will find a sheltered place among the hazel woods and sleep there. I should be ashamed, Eska said simply. Marcus said, then we had best set about choosing our quarters. They settled finally on one end of a barrack row, where the roof had not fallen in, and the few feet of timber and rotten thatch made a shelter from the coming rain. There they unloaded the mares, rubbed them down, and turned them loose in the long building in the British fashion, after which Aska went off to gather a few armfuls of fodder and bracken for bedding, while Marcus collected a stock of the rotten timber which lay about and got a fire going, watched with close attention by Vespania and Mina. Later that evening, the tumble-down shelter bore a much more cheerful aspect. A small fire burned brightly at its entrance, the smoke finding its own way round the bat-wing edge of the rotten thatch, into the darkening sky, and the piled bracken in the far corner spread with the sheepskins, which by day were folded to serve as saddles. Marcus and Esca ate some of the food which they had brought with them from last night's village, coarse barley bannock, and strips of strong part-smoked deer meat, which they broiled over the fire, and afterwards Esca lay down at once to sleep. But Marcus sat up for a while beside the fire, watching the sparks fly upward, hearing nothing but the occasional shifting of the mares in the further shadows. From time to time he bent forward to put more wood on the fire. Otherwise he sat quite unmoving, while on the piled bracken against the wall Esca slept the quiet light sleep of the hunter. Looking at him, Marcus wondered whether he would have had the courage to lie quietly down to sleep on what he believed to be haunted ground. With the full dark, the rain came up, soft, heavy swaths of rain, and the swish and whisper of it on the rotten thatch seemed to deepen the utter desolation of this place, that had once been living and was now dead. And Marcus found himself listening with straining ears to the silence, his thoughts growing full of crowding ghosts that came and went along the rampart walls and through the forsaken forum, until it was all he could do to make himself bank the fire and lie down beside Aska. Normally, when they camped in the wild, they took turns to sit up and keep the fire in while the other slept. But here, with 4 walls round them and a pile of thorn branches across the door to keep the horses in, there could be no need for that. For a while he lay wakeful, every nerve jumping with a queer expectancy. But he was tired, and the spread skins and the fragrant high-piled bracken were very comfortable, and before long he fell asleep and dreamed that he was watching legionaries at pilum practice, quite ordinary legionaries, save that between their chin straps and the curves of their helmets they had no faces. He woke to a sense of light, steady pressure below his left ear, woke quietly and completely, as people roused in that way always do, and opened his eyes to see that the fire had sunk to a few red embers, and Aska was crouching beside him in the first faint pallor of the dawn. The evil taste of the dream was still in his mouth. "What is it?" he whispered. "Listen." Marcus listened, and felt a small unpleasant chill trickling up his spine. His own eerie fancies of last night returned to him uncomfortably. Maybe Aska had been right about this place after all, for somewhere in the abandoned fort somebody or something was whistling the tune of a song that he knew well. He had marched to it more than once, for though an old song, it was a favorite with the legions, and for no particular reason had outlived many and many that they picked up and marched to for a few months and then forgot. Oh, when I joined the eagles, as it might be yesterday, I kissed a girl at Clusium before I marched away. The familiar words joined themselves to the tune in Marcus's head as he rose silently and stood getting his stiffened leg into marching order. The whistling was drawing nearer, becoming every moment more clearly recognizable. A long march, and 20 years in store, when I left my girl at Clusium beside the threshing floor. There were many more verses, all describing girls that the maker of the song had kissed in different ports of the empire, but as Marcus went purposefully to the doorway, and Aska stooped to drag aside the thorn branches, the whistling ceased, and a husky voice, with a queer brooding quality in it, as though the singer's thoughts were turned inward and backward, took up the song at the last verse of all. The girls of Spain were honey sweet, and the golden girls of Gaul, and the Thracian maids were soft as birds, to hold the heart in thrall. But the girl I kissed at Clusium, kissed and left at Clusium, the girl I kissed at Clusium, I remember best of all. A long march, and 20 years behind, but the girl I kissed at Clusium comes easy to my mind. Rounding the end of the barrack row, they came face to face with the singer, who was standing in the sinister gate. Marcus had not known what he had expected to see, perhaps nothing, which would have been worst of all. But what he did see pulled him up in astonishment. For the man, it was no ghost, standing with his hand on the bridle of a rough-coated pony, was one of the painted people, such as he had lived among all summer. The man had checked at sight of Marcus and Esca, and stood looking at them warily with upflung head, like a stag when it scents danger, his hunting spear held as though for instant attack. For a moment they surveyed each other in the dawn light. Then Marcus broke the silence. By now he could make himself understood without much trouble in the dialect of the northern tribes. "It has been a good hunting, friend," he said, pointing to the carcass of a half-grown roebuck that he slung across the pony's back. "Good enough until I can do better," said the man. "There is none to spare." "We have food of our own," Marcus said. "Also, we have a fire, and unless it seems good to you to build your own or eat your meal raw, you are welcome to share it." "What do you here in the place of 3 hills?" asked the man suspiciously. "Camp for the night, not knowing how far we might be from a village, and judging that rain was on the way, it seemed to us a better sleeping place than the open moor. Is not the place of 3 hills free to all, or only to the raven and the lizard and yourself?" For an instant the man did not answer. Then slowly and deliberately he reversed the spear in his hand, so that he was carrying it with head trailing as a man carries his spear when he comes in peace. "I think that you will be the healer of sore eyes, of whom I have heard," he said. "I am." "I will come and share your fire." He turned and whistled, and in answer to the summons, 2 swift, brindled hunting dogs came springing up through the bracken to join him. A few moments later, they were back in their shelter, and the small shaggy pony, free of his burden now, was hitched to a fallen beam beside the door. Eska threw a birch branch on to the red embers, and as the silver bark blackened and flared up, Marcus turned for a better look at the stranger. He was a middle-aged man, lean and powerful, his eyes wary and a little furtive under the wild hair that was coarse and gray as a badger's pelt. He wore nothing but an ochre-colored kilt, and in the light of the fire his body and arms were covered all over with bands of tattooing, after the manner of the painted people. Even on his cheeks and forehead and wings of his nostrils, the blue curves and spandrels showed. The dogs were nosing at the body of the deer, which lay at his feet, and as their master stooped to cuff them away, the firelight fell strongly, slantwise, across his forehead, throwing into relief the scar of a curiously shaped brand just beneath the brows. Eska squatted down by the fire and put more strips of smoked meat to broil in the hot ash, then sat with his arms across his knees and his spear within easy reach, watching the stranger under his brows, while the stranger, kneeling over the flattened carcass of the buck, which had been greloched already, began to skin it with the long hunting knife which he drew from his rawhide belt. Marcus also watched him, though less obviously. He was puzzled. The man seemed a tribesman like any other of his kind, yet he had sung the girl I kissed at Clusium in good Latin, and at some time, years ago, to judge by the faintness of the scar, he had been initiated into the raven degree of Mithras. He might, of course, have learned the song from the legionaries who had served here. He was fully old enough for that. Mithra sometimes found followers in unexpected places, but taking the two things together, it was unusual to say the least of it, and Marcus had been looking for something unusual all summer. The hunter had laid back a large flap of hide from the flank and haunch of the buck. He cut thick collops of meat from it, and a shapeless lump with the hair still on, which he flung to the dogs who crouched beside him, and while they fought over it, snarling and worrying, he heaved up what remained of the carcass and flung it across a half-rotten tie-beam, where it hung, the dangling legs out of reach of the hounds. He put the collops and that he had cut for his own eating to broil in the hot ash, rubbed his hands on his kilt, for they were juicy, and sitting back on his heels, peered from Marcus to Eska and back again with a strange, intent look, as though their faces, Marcus at all events, had some meaning for him which he could not fathom. "I thank you for the heat of your fire," he said, speaking less roughly than he had done before. "It is in my heart that I might have been swifter to reverse my spear, but I had not thought to find any before me, here in the place of 3 hills." "I can well believe that," Marcus said. In all the years I have come here on the hunting trail, never until now have I found any man here before me. And now you have found 2. And since we share the same fire," said Marcus with a smile, "surely we should know each other's names. I am Demetrius of Alexandria, a traveling occultist, as you seem to know. And this, my friend and spear-bearer, is Eska Mac Cunnaval, of the tribe of the Brigantes, the bearers of the blue war shield. You have heard maybe of my tribe, if not of me, added Eska, and his teeth flashed white in his tanned face as he lifted his head and smiled. I have heard of your tribe. A little, yes, said the stranger, with, as it seemed to Marcus, a hint of grim amusement in his voice, though there was no amusement in his gaunt face as he blinked at the fire. For myself, I am called Gorn, and I am a hunter, as you see. My wrath lies upwards of the day's trail, to the west, and I come here sometimes for the sake of the fat deer to be had in the hazel woods yonder. Silence fell between the three, while the daylight grew around them, and the dogs snarled and tussled over their lump of meat. Then Marcus, idly peeling a bit of stick, began, half under his breath, to whistle the tune that had so startled him an hour before. Out on the corner of his eyes, he was aware that Gurn had started and looked towards him. For a few moments he continued with the pealing and the whistling, and then, seeming suddenly to tire of his pastime, tossed the stick into the fire and looked up. Where did you learn that song, friend? Gurn the hunter. Where else but here? Said Gurn. For an instant his face took on a look of blank stupidity, but Marcus had an idea that behind it he was thinking furiously. When this was a Roman fort, there were many Roman songs sung here. That one I learned from a centurion who used to hunt boar with me. I was only a boy, but I have a good memory. Did you pick up any Latin other than the words of the song? Marcus shot at him, speaking in that language. The hunter made as if to answer, checked, and looked at him an instant slantwise, under down-twitched brows. Then he spoke in Latin, very slowly, like a man fumbling back across the years for a speech that comes half forgotten to his tongue. A few words I remember still, such words as soldiers use. Then dropping back into the Celtic speech, where did you learn that song? I have followed my trade in fortress towns before now, Marcus said, and ones that were not deserted to the wild boar, as the place of 3 hills. I have a quick ear for a tune. Gurn leaned forward to turn the cooking meat with his hunting knife. Yet surely you can have been but a short while at this trade you practice. There are not many years under that beard of yours. Maybe there are more than there seem, Marcus said, and stroked the beard tenderly. It had grown well in the months since he came north, though it was still very clearly a young beard. Moreover, I began early following my father's footsteps in the way of sons, and talking of this trade of mine, are there any that have sore eyes in your village? Gurn poked experimentally at the meat. He seemed to be making up his mind about something, and after a few moments he looked up as though he had made it. I am an outdweller, living to myself and my family, he said, and we have no sore eyes for your healing. Nonetheless, if you wait until my hunting is done, you are very welcome to come with me, and we will eat salt together, and later I will set you on your way to another village. That is for the place that you have given me at your fire." For an instant Marcus hesitated. Then, with the instinct still strong upon him that this man was not what he seemed, he said, "All ways are alike to us. We will come, and gladly. There is more flesh on my keel than I had thought," said Gurn, suddenly and shamefacedly, and stood up, knife in hand. So the three of them ate fresh broiled buck together in good fellowship, and a day later, when Gurn's hunting was done, they set out, Marcus and Eska riding, and the hunter leading his own pony, across whose back was bound the carcass of a great red stag, and the dogs cantering ahead. Swishing through the rain-wet bracken they went, over the heathery shoulder of three-headed Eldon, and away into the west, leaving the red sandstone fort deserted once again to the creatures of the wild. Chapter 13. The Lost Legion. Gurn's homestead, when they reached it, proved to be a bleak huddle of turfs huts high among the dark moors. A small boy, herding wild-eyed cattle up from the drinking pool to the nighttime shelter of the cattle yard, greeted their appearance with a kind of fascinated dismay. Evidently, strangers were not in his scheme of things, and while stealing constant sly peeps at them, he took care to keep the great herd bull, which he managed with casual pokes and slaps, between him and danger as they went on towards the rath together. "This is my house," said Gurn, the hunter, as they reined in before the largest of the huts. It is yours so long as it pleases you." They dismounted, while the yelling boy and the lowing herd pelted by the direction of the cattle yard, and tossing the reins over a hitching post, turned to the doorway. A girl child of perhaps 18 months old, wearing nothing but a red coral bead on a thong round her neck to ward off the evil eye, sat before the door, busily playing with 3 dandelions, a bone, and a stripped pebble. One of the hounds poked a friendly muzzle into the face as he stalked past her into the darkness, and she made a grab at his disappearing tail and fell over. The doorway was so small that Marcus had to bend double under the heather thatch as he stepped over the little sprawling figure, and followed his host steeply down into the firelit gloom. The blue peat smoke caught him by the throat and made his eyes smart, but he was used to that by now, and a woman rose from beside the central hearth. "Myrna, I have brought home the healer of sore eyes and his spear-bearer," said Gurn. "Do you make them welcome while I tend to their horses and the fruits of my hunting?" "They are very welcome," said the woman, "though praise be to the horned one. There are no sore eyes here." "Good fortune on the house and on the women of the house," Marcus said courteously. Aska had followed their house out again, trusting no one but himself to see to the mares, and Marcus sat down on the roe deerskin that the woman spread for him on the piled heather of the bedplace, and watched her as she returned to whatever she was cooking in the bronze cauldron over the fire. As his eyes grew used to the peat smoke and to the faint light which filtered down through the narrow doorway and the smoke hole in the roof, he saw that she was much younger than Gurn, a tall, raw-boned woman with a contented face. Her tunic was of coarse reddish wool, such as only a poor woman would have worn in the South. But clearly she was not a poor woman, or rather her husband was not a poor man, for there were bracelets of silver and copper and blue Egyptian glass on her arms, and the mass of dull gold hair knotted up behind her head was held in place with amber-headed pins. Above all, she was the proud possessor of a large bronze cauldron. Marcus had been long enough in the wilderness to know that a bronze cauldron, more than anything else, brought a woman the envy of her neighbors. After a short while, footsteps sounded outside, and Eska and Gurn came ducking in, followed almost at once by the small herdsman and an even younger boy, both very like Gurn in face, and already tattooed as he was against the day when they would be warriors. They watched the strangers warily under their brows, and drew back against the far wall of the hut, while their mother brought bowls of black pottery from their inner place, and served the steaming stew to the three men sitting side by side on the bedplace. She poured yellow mead for them into the great ox horns, and then went to eat their own meal on the far side of the fire, the women's side, with the small girl child in her lap. The younger boy sat with her, but the elder, suddenly overcoming his distrust, came edging round to examine Marcus's dagger, and finished up by sharing his bowl. They were a pleasant small family, yet oddly isolated in a land where most people lived in groups for greater safety, and it seemed to Marcus that here was another hint of the unusual to add to the song and the brand of Mithras. It was next morning that he got the final proof of his suspicions. That morning, Gurn decided to shave. Like many of the British tribesmen, he went more or less clean-shaven, save for his upper lip, and he was certainly in need of a shave. As soon as he announced his intention, preparations began as though for a solemn festival. His wife brought him a pot of goose fat to soften his beard, and the whole family gathered to watch their lord and master at his toilet. And so, amid an enthralled audience of three children and several dogs sitting in the early light before the hut place door, Gurn the hunter set to work scraping away at his chin with a heart-shaped bronze razor. How little difference there was between children, all the world over, Marcus thought, looking on with amusement, or fathers, or shaving, for that matter, the small patterns of behavior and relationship that made up family life. He remembered the fascination of watching his own father on such occasions. Gurn squinted at his reflection in the polished bronze disc his patient wife was holding for him, cocked his head this way and that, and scraped away with an expression of acute agony that made Marcus look forward with foreboding to the day when he and Eska would have to rid themselves of their own beards. Gurn had begun to shave under his chin, tipping his head far back, and as he did so, Marcus saw that just under the point of his jaw the skin was paler than elsewhere, and had a thickened look almost like the scar of an old Gaul. It was very faint, but still to be seen, the mark made by the chin strap of the Roman helmet through many years of wearing it. Marcus had seen that Gaul too often to be mistaken in it, and his last doubt was gone. Something forbade him to tax Gurn with his old life. Here, at the heart of the new life that he had made. And so, a little later, while preparing to take the trail once more, he reminded the hunter of his promise to set them on their way to the next village. He had a mind to go westward, he said, and Gurn replied willingly enough that since westward there were no more villages for 2 days' trail, if they were set on going that way, he would ride with them the first day and share their camp that night. So presently they set out, and in the long shadowed evening, many miles to the west, the three of them ate their evening meal in the curved lee of a rocky outcrop, and afterwards sat together round their small fire, their 3 mounts, each hobbled by a rein from the head to the left foreleg to prevent them straying, cropped contentedly at the short hill turf that spread here and there like green runnels among the bell heather. Below them the hills rolled away northwestward, falling gradually to a blue haze of a low ground, maybe 40 miles away, and Marcus followed the fall of them with his eyes, knowing that somewhere in the blueness the wreck of Agricola's northern wall slashed across the land, severing Valentia from the country beyond that the Romans called Caledonia, and the Celts Albu, knowing that somewhere beyond the blueness was the lost eagle of his father's legion. In all the world there seemed no sound but the dry soughing of the wind through the heather, and the sharp yelp of a gold eagle circling the blue spirals of the upper air. Esca had drawn back a little into the heather, and sat polishing his spear, and Marcus and Gurn were alone by the fire save for the hunter's favourite hound, who lay nose on paws with his flank against his master's thigh. Presently Marcus turned to his companion. "Soon, very soon now, our ways part," he said. "But before you go your way and I go mine, there is a question that I have in my heart to ask you." "Ask, then," said the other, playing with his dog's ears. Marcus said slowly, "How did you come to be Gurn, the hunter who once served with the eagles?" There was a sudden flicker in the other's eyes, and then for a long moment he became very still, with a sullen stillness, peering at Marcus under his brows, in the way of the painted people. "Who told you such a thing?" he asked at last. "No one. I go by a song, and the scar between your brows, but most of all by the gall mark under your chin." "If I were what you say," Gurn growled, "what need have I tell you of it? I am a man of my tribe, and if I was not always so, there is none among my sword brethren who would speak of that to a stranger. What need, then, have I to tell? None in the world, said Marcus, save that I asked you in all courtesy. There was another long silence, and then his companion said, with a queer mingling of sullen defiance and long-forgotten pride, I was once sixth centurion of the senior cohort of the Hispania. Now go and tell it to the nearest commander on the wall. I shall not stop you. Marcus took his time, sitting quiet and searching the fierce face of the man before him. He was looking for any trace that might be left under the painted hunter of the Roman centurion of 12 years ago, and presently he thought he had found it. No patrol could reach you, and you know it, he said. But even if it were not so, still there is a reason that I should keep my mouth shut. And that reason, Marcus said, that I bear on my forehead a mark which is brother to the mark that you bear on yours. And with a quick movement he freed the crimson ribbon and bound the silver talisman in place, and jerked it off. Look. The other bent forward swiftly. So, he said, lingeringly, never before have I known one of your trade who made his evening prayer to Mithras. But even as he spoke, his gaze narrowed into a new intentness, became like a dagger thrust. Who are you? What are you? He demanded, and suddenly his hands were on Marcus's shoulders, wrenching him round to face the last windy gold of the sunset. For a long moment he held them so, kneeling over him and glaring into his face, while Marcus, with his lame leg twisted under him, stared back, his black brows frowning, his mouth at its most disdainful. The great hound crouched watchfully beside them, and Aska got quietly up, fingering his spear, both man and hound ready to kill at a word. I have seen you before, said Gurn, in a rasping voice. I remember your face. In the name of light, who are you? Maybe it is my father's face that you remember. He was your cohort commander. Slowly, Gurn's hands relaxed and dropped to his side. I should have known, he said. It was the talisman and the beard. But nonetheless, I should have known. He sat rocking himself a little, almost as if he were in pain, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. What is it that you do, your father's son, here in Valentia? He said at last. You are no Greek of Alexandria, and I think that you are no eye doctor. No, I am no eye doctor. Nevertheless, the salves that I carry are good, and I was shown how to work with them by one skilled in their use. When I told you that I had followed my father's trade, that at last was the truth. I followed it until I got me this leg and my discharge 2 years ago. As to what I do here in Valentia, he hesitated, but only for an instant. He knew that in this one matter, at least, he could trust Gurn utterly. And so, briefly, he told him what it was he did in Valentia, and why. And when it seemed to me that you were not as the other hunters of the painted people, he finished, It seemed to me that from you I might learn the answer to my questions. And could you not have asked me at the first? Because I was drawn to you, not knowing why, and because you spoke the Latin tongue that I had not heard these 12 years. I brought you to my own place, and you slept under my roof, and ate of my salt, with this hidden in your heart concerning me. It would have been better that you asked me at the first. Much better, Marcus agreed. But all that I had in my heart concerning you was a guess, and a wild guess. Enough. If I had spoken out to you without first being sure, and found too late that you were, after all, no other than you seemed, would there not have been Ahriman, the Dark One, to pay? What is it that you want to know? Gurn said dully, after a moment. What become of my father's legion? Where is the eagle now? Gurn looked down at his own hand on the head of the great dog, who was once more lying quiet beside him, and then up again. I can answer the first of your questions, at least in part, he said, but it's a long story, and first I will mend the fire. He leaned forward as he spoke, and fed the sinking flames from the pile of thorn branches and heather snarls beside him. He did it slowly, deliberately, as though holding off the moment when he must begin the story. But even when the flames sprang up again, he still squatted silent on his haunches, staring into the smoke. Marcus's heart had begun to race, and suddenly he felt a little sick. You never knew your father's legion? Gurn began at last. No, and if you had, you would have been too young to read the signs. Too young by many years. He had changed his tongue to Latin, and with the change all that was of the tribes in him seemed to have dropped away. The seeds of death were in the Hispana before ever it marched north that last time. They were sown 60 years now, when men of the legion carried out the procurator's orders to dispossess the queen of the Iceni. Boudica her name was. Maybe you have heard of her. She cursed them and their whole legion, it is said, for the treatment that she had at their hands, which was hardly just, for they had their orders. If she was minded to curse anyone, it had better have been the procurator himself. But a woman who thinks herself wronged is seldom over particular where her thrust lands, so that it draws blood. Me, I am not one to set much store by cursings, or I was not in the old days. But be that as it may, the legion was cut to pieces in the rising that followed. When at last the rising failed, the queen took poison, and maybe her death gave potency to her cursing. The legion was reformed and brought up to strength again, but it never prospered. Perhaps if it had been moved elsewhere, it might have been saved. But for a legion to serve year after year, generation after generation, among tribes who believe it to be accursed, is not good for that legion. Small misfortunes bloat into large ones. Outbreaks of sickness are set down to the working of the curse instead of the marsh mists. The Spaniards are a people quick to believe in such things, so it became harder to find recruits, and the standard of those taken grew lower year by year. It was very slow at first. I have served with men no older than myself who remembered the ninth, when it was only a little rough and run to seed. But at the last it was terribly swift, and when I joined the Legion as a centurion 2 years before the end, I was promised from the ranks of the 13th, which was a proud legion. The Rhine seemed sound enough, but the heart was rotten, stinking rotten. Gurn the hunter spat into the fire. I strove to fight the rot in my own century at first, and then the fighting grew to be much more trouble. The last legate was a hard and upright man without understanding, the worst man to handle such a legion, and soon after his coming the Emperor Trajan withdrew too many troops from Britain for his everlasting campaigns, and we, who were left to hold the frontier, began to feel the tribes seethe under us like an overripe cheese. Then Trajan died, and the tribes rose. The whole north went up in flames, and barely had we settled with the Brigantes and the Iceni when we were ordered up into Valentia to hammer the Caledonians, who of our cohorts were serving in Germany. We had suffered heavy casualties already, and heaving a cohort to garrison Eburacum and be cut to shreds by the Brigantes, if they happened to feel like it, that left well under the 4,000 of us to march north. And when the legate took the omens in the usual way, the sacred chickens had gone off their feed and would not touch the pulse he threw to them. After that, we gave ourselves up for doomed, which is a bad state for a legion to march in. It was autumn, and almost from the start the mountain country was blanketed in mist, and out of the mist the tribesmen harried us. Oh, it never came to a fight. They hung about our flanks like wolves. They made sudden raids on our rear guard, and loosed their arrows into us from behind every tuft of sodden heather, and disappeared into the mist before we could come to grips with them, and the parties sent out after them never came back. A legate who was also a soldier might have saved us. Ours had seen no more of a soldiering than a sham fight on Mars Field, and was too proud to listen to his officers, who had, and by the time we reached Agricola's old headquarters on the northern wall, which was to be our base, upward another 1,000 of us had gone to by death or desertion. The old fortifications were crumbling, the water supply had long since given out, and the whole north had gathered in strength by then. They sat round the walls and yelled, like wolves howling to the moon. We stood one attack in the place. We rolled the dead down the scarp into the river, and when the tribes drew off to lick their wounds, we chose a spokesman and went to the legate and said, "Now we will make what terms we can with the painted people, that they may let us march back the way we came, leaving Valentia in their hands, for it is no more than a name, and the name that tastes sour on the tongue at that." And the legate sat in his camp chair, which we had to carry for him all the way from Ibericum, and called us evil names. Doubtless we deserved the names, but they did not help. Then more than half of us mutinied, many of my own century among them. A legate, who was also a soldier, might have saved us. Ours had seen no more of soldiering than a sham fight on Mars Field, and was too proud to listen to his officers, who had, and by the time we reached Agricola's old headquarters on the northern wall, which was to be our base, upward of another 1,000 of us had gone by death or desertion. The old fortifications were crumbling. The water supply had long since given out, and the whole Ninth had gathered in strength by then. They sat round the walls and yelled like wolves howling to the moon. We stood one attack in that place. We rolled the dead down the scarp into the river, and when the tribes drew off to lick their wounds, we chose a spokesman and went to the legate and said, "Now we will make what terms we can with the painted people, that they may let us march back the way we came, leaving Valentia in their hands, for it is no more than a name, and a name that tastes sour on the tongue at that." And the legate sat in his camp chair, which we had to carry for him all the way from Ibericum, and called us evil names. Doubtless we deserved the names, but they did not help. Then more than half of us mutinied, many of my own century among them. Gurn turned from the fire to face Marcus. I was not one of them. Before the Lord of the Legions, I swear it. My full shame was not yet come upon me, and I held the few men left to me in leash yet a while. Then the legate saw where his mistake had lain, and he spoke more gently to his legion in revolt than ever he had done before, and that was not from fear. He bade the mutineers lay down the arms that they had taken up against their eagle, and swore that there should be no summary punishment, even of the ringleaders, swore that if we did our duty from thenceforth, he would make fair report of it, the good with the bad, on our return, as though we should ever return. But even had the way back been clear, it was too late for such promises. From the moment that the cohorts mutinied, it was too late. There could be no turning back for them, knowing all too well what the word of the Senate would be. "Decimation," Marcus said quietly, as the others halted. "Aye, decimation. It comes hard to draw lots out of a helmet, knowing that 1 in every 10 means death by stoning to the man who draws it. So the thing ended in fighting. That was when the legate was killed. He was a brave man, though a fool. He stood out before the mob with his hands empty, and his eagle bearer and his beardless tribunes behind him, and called on them to remember their oath, and called them curs of Tiberside. Then one struck him down with a pilum, and after that there was no more talking. The tribesmen came swarming in over the barricades to help the red work, and by dawn there were barely 2 full cohorts left alive in the fort. The rest were not all dead. Oh no, many of them went back over the ramparts with the tribesmen. They may be scattered about Caledonia now, for all I know, living even as myself with a British wife, and sons to come after them. Just after dawn, your father called together the few that were left in the open space before the praetorium, and there, every man with his sword ready in his hand, we took hurried counsel, and determined to win out of the old fort, which was become a death trap, and carry the eagle back to Ibericum as best we might. It was no use by then to think of making terms with the tribesmen, for they had no longer any cause to fear us. And besides, I think there was the thought in all of us that if we went through, the Senate could scarcely count us as disgraced. That night the fools feasted so slow, and we sunk in their contempt. And while they drank, baying to the moon, we got out, all that were left of us, by the southern scarp, and passed them by in the darkness and the mist. The first time ever the mist had seemed our friend, and began the forced march back, heading for Trinomontium. The tribes picked up our trail at dawn and hunted us as though it had been for sport. Have you ever been hunted? All the day we struggled on, and the sorest wounded who dropped out died. Sometimes we heard them die in the mist. Then I dropped out too. Gurn rubbed his left flank. I had a wound, and I could put 3 fingers in. And I was sick, but I could have gone on. It was being hunted, the being hunted. I took my chance at dusk. When the hunters drew off a space, I slipped into some long furze cover and hid. One of the painted people nearly trod on me presently, but they did not find me. And after dark, when the hunt had passed far away, I stripped off my harness and left it. I look like a Pict, do I not? That is because I am from northern Gaul. Then I suppose I wandered all night. I do not know, but in the dawn I came to a village and fell across the door still of the first hut. They took me in and tended me. Myrna tended me. And when they found that I was a Roman soldier, they did not greatly care. I was not the first of my kind to desert to the tribes, and Myrna spoke for me, like a lioness whose cub is threatened. For an instant, a glint of laughter sounded in his voice, and then it grew harsh and heavy again. A few nights later, I saw the eagle carried by on its way north again, with a great triumph of torches following behind. There was a long, strained silence. Then Marcus said in a quiet, hard voice, "Where did they make an end?" "I do not know. But they never reached Trinomontium. I have looked there again and again, and found no sign of fighting." "And my father?" "He was with the Eagle when I dropped out. There were no captives with it when he carried it north again." "Where is the Eagle now?" Gurn reached out and touched the dagger in the other's belt, looking at him steadily. "If you are minded to die, here is the means in your hand. Save yourself the further journey." "Where is the Eagle now?" Marcus repeated his question, as though the other had not spoken. For a moment he held the hunter's eyes with his own. Then Gurn said, "I do not know. But tomorrow, when there is light to see, I will give you what direction I can." And Marcus realized suddenly that he was seeing the other's face by firelight, and all beyond him was blurred into the blue dusk. He did not sleep much that night, but lay rigid with his head in his arms. All these months he had followed a dream, in a way, he realized. Now he had followed it since he was 8 years old. It had been bright and warm, and now it was broken. And without it, he felt very cold and suddenly older than he had been a few hours ago. What a fool he had been! What a blind fool! Clinging to the stubborn faith that, because it had been his father's, there had been nothing much wrong with the Ninth Legion, after all. He knew better now. His father's legion had been putrid, a rotten apple that fell to pieces when it was struck by a heel. And God of the legions, what his father must have suffered. Out of the ruin, one thing stood up unchanged, that the Eagle was still to be found and brought back, lest one day it became a menace to the frontier. There was something comforting about that, a faith still to be kept. The next morning, when the early meal had been eaten, and the fire quenched and scattered, Marcus stood beside his mare, looking away northwest, along the line of Gurn's pointing finger. The light wind whipped his face, and his morning shadow ran away downhill as though eager to be off before him, and he heard the wild, sweet calling of the green plover that seemed to be the voice of the great loneliness. "Yonder, where the vale opens," Gurn was saying, "you will know the ford by the leaning pine that grows beside it. You must cross there, and follow the right bank, or you will find yourself at the last with the whole broad firth of Cluta between you and Caledonia. 2 days' march, 3 at the most, will bring you to the old northern line." "And then?" Marcus said, not turning his narrowed gaze from the blue haze distance. "I can tell you only this, that the men who carried the Eagle north were of the tribe of the Epidae, whose territory is the deep firths and the mountains of the west coast, running from the Cluta. Can you hazard any guess as to where in this territory their holy place may be?" None. It may be that if you find the world done, you will find the holy place not far off. But the Epidai is divided into many clans, so I have heard, and the royal clan may not be the guardians of the holy place and the holy things of the tribe. You mean it might be some quite small and unimportant clan? Not unimportant. It would be as powerful as the royal clan, maybe more so. But small, yes. There is no more help that I can give you. They were silent a moment, until there sounded behind them the faint jink of a bridle bit, as Aska brought up the other mare. Then Gurn said hurriedly, "Do not follow that trail. It leads into the mouth of death." "I must take my chance of that," Marcus said. He turned his head. "And you, Eska?" "I go where you go," said Eska, busy with a buckle. "Why?" Gurn demanded. "Now that you know the truth. They will not reform the Legion. Why would you go on? Why?" "There is still the eagle to be brought back," Marcus said. Another silence, and then Gurn said almost humbly, "You have said nothing about all this that I have told you. No more than if it had been a story told to while away any idle evening." "What should I say?" The other laughed shortly and harshly. "Mithras knows. But my belly would be the lighter if you said it." "Last night I felt too sick in my own belly to care over much of yours," Marcus said wearily. "That is past now. But if I curse the Hispana with every foul Tiberside word that I could lay my tongue to, it would not serve my father, nor sweeten the stink of the Legion's name." He looked for the first time at the man beside him. "As for you, I have been hunted, and the Lord of the Legions forbid that I should be your judge." The other said defiantly, "Why did you come?" "I was happy with my woman. She is a good woman to me. I am a great man in my tribe, though an outdweller. Often I forget almost that I was not born into my tribe, until once again Trinomontium draws me back for a little while. And now I shall be ashamed to my dying day because I let you go north on this trail alone." "No need that you should carry a new shame," Marcus said. "This is a trail that 3 can follow better than 4, and 2 better than 3. Go back to your tribe, Gurn. Thank you for your salt and your shelter, and for answering my questions." He turned away to mount his horse, and a few moments later was heading down the stream side with Eska close behind.